And welcome to our fifth and final Lunch and Learn for Truth and Reconciliation Week 2024. My name is Sandra Bender, and I am the Community Engagement and Education Program Coordinator with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that wherever we are watching from, either today or in the future, if you're watching this on our YouTube channel down the road, we are all located on the ancestral lands of the First Peoples. Some of those lands have been entered into treaty relationships, others have not. We acknowledge the land and waters that sustain all of our lives and the stewardship of the First Peoples in caring for those lands and waters since time immemorial. The topic for today's session is addressing the ongoing barriers to reconciliation, including a look at the lack of progress on the TRC's calls to action and what Canadians need to do to keep moving reconciliation forward. We have three amazing guests to lead us through this discussion. Our speakers, residential school survivor Dr. Levinia Brown and sociology professor Dr. Eva Jewell, and our moderator for today, Cole Kippenhuck. Just for a bit of housekeeping before I turn it over to Cole to introduce our speakers, I'll just note this is a Zoom webinar, so that you'll see there that the chat function is not enabled. You have the ability to raise your hands, but we do not have the ability to unmute you and let you ask your questions out loud. So there is not very much point in raising your hands. However, there is a Q&A box that you can use to put your questions in. There will be time to answer some questions, but I'll just note that there are already over 2,000 people in the Zoom room alone, more on YouTube. So we will absolutely not have a chance to answer all of your questions, but we will do our very, very best. So we have ASL interpretation for this session. Et il y a aussi une traduction simultanée, je m'excuse, en français disponible sous le bouton interprétation en bas de l'écran. This session will be recorded and uploaded to the NCTR YouTube channel following the session. There was already a question about where to find those. My pro tip is look under the tab that says live. Now, our moderator for today, Cole Kippenhuck, is a two-spirit Inuit-Labradorian with over 20 years of experience in nonprofit, private consulting, and government work. They are the owner of Crow Kinship Consulting, and their lived experiences of violence, trauma, and addictions have contributed to a healing path of cultural revitalization, fluidity in all areas of living, and giving back to communities. Cole is a person of ceremony and a respected Indigenous knowledge holder and land protector. As a life coach, Cole works one-on-one to support individuals in bringing fluidity to their lives, especially their sexuality, relationships, gender, and emotional healing journeys. Cole, thank you for leading us today. I turn it over to you.
Nakamik, thank you, Sandra, and to the whole NCTR team for bringing us together in this way to honor the wrap up of this week. So I want to say to welcome to everyone who is in attendance, and especially a welcome, and I'm so honored to share space with both Levinia and with Eva and to have this discussion today that I'm so looking forward to having. So Levinia, I will pass it over to you to introduce yourself if that feels comfortable for you, and then Eva, you can go afterwards, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, my name is Levinia Brown. Inuktitut name is Nukadlak. Nukadlak means spider web. I am from Rankin Inlet, Nunavut. Our community population is about 3,200. It's right north of Winnipeg. 2 hours and maybe 15-20 minutes by jet service twice a day, every day. And my background is in nursing and teaching. That's what I've done most of my life. And I've been involved in politics. I was the first mayor, woman mayor in my community, Rankin Inlet, 1989. And then I further on went into politics because I felt our women need to be involved and be represented. because we have a lot of women too, and plus the children. So that was my interest to represent the women.
Bonjour, Kina, Eva Jewell, Shaganashi, no Swin, Dishkanzi being Anishinaabe Kwendao. I'm greeting you all. My name is Eva Jewell. I am Anishinaabe from Dishkanzibing, which is 2 hours southwest of Toronto in Southern Ontario. We're one of the most Southern First Nations, so it's really great to be in conversation with my Northern relatives here. I am a research director at Yellowhead Institute, which is a think tank that supports Indigenous jurisdiction through developing critical policy perspectives. And for 5 years, I authored an accountability report that checked in on the status of the calls to action. And I co-authored that with my colleague, Dr. Ian Mosby. And so now I am I'm still a professor at Toronto Metropolitan University. Language.
Beautiful. So glad to have you both here. And I'm going to start our discussion, which is such a rich conversation around how do we address barriers to reconciliation? That's a huge question. We could spend much longer than an hour discussing it. And so I will move right into this, but I want to use a quote actually that was that Eva came from yourself in 2021 that I think can help us as we frame how we want to move forward with this discussion. So to the question, when will it be enough? We say it will be enough when the systems of oppression no longer exist. We will arrive at reconciliation when Indigenous peoples in this country experience, at the bare minimum, a living standard that reflects their visions of healthy and prosperous communities. I think this is really important thing that we look at what is a reconciled nation as we see it. And I'm going to move right into the questions because I'm very eager to hear your thoughts. And the first question that we have is, what do you see as some of the barriers to reconciliation that are still out there that you notice or you encounter in your own life or in the work that you do? And Levinia, we will start with you with that question if you feel comfortable.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the word itself, reconciliation, is very big word. Some people even have a hard time pronouncing it, especially if you're Indigenous person. It's huge, and inside the Truth and Reconciliation, there's 94 recommendation, and you know, that's a lot of work for the country to be action. And if you want to know about my country, not my country, but my territory, where I come from, my community, truth and reconciliation have to be recognized where our resources are limited, where our Inuit people are having a hard time getting jobs, and the government say that they had to have 85% Inuit hire. They've never ever reached that yet since we have our own government since 1999. It's playing around 51, maybe 50% back and forth. That's where it's at. It's never reached 60%. So that would be reconciliation. If they reach the 85%, would be a big margin and big help. And in my community, I can speak for my community because I see it. We need reconciliation for infrastructure, housing, major problem, major. It was never like that. We've never had any homelessness. We've never had overcrowding, never. We looked after ourselves. We were independent. We were reliant, everything like that. And when the government, federal government moved us to communities, the elders were saying they became more poor being in the community. Today is a big evidence where the biggest problem is housing. There's a biggest problem with mental health. lots of mental health issues right now. That's one thing that I realize, it's from overcrowding. There could be 22 people living in 2-bedroom house. 1-bedroom apartment house could have 10 people in it. No, that's where the problem is. Reconciliation, we want to make sure it's addressed. We want to make sure that we're happy like we should be. And I seem to see two streams. There's this problem with overcrowding causing a lot of major mental health. And then on this stream, we have young people that are achieving, doing well. Secondary education, they're having their own businesses. They're showing us good life, the way we should be all in all of the world. Good life, knowing yourself, knowing where you come from, and treating each other with respect. So I'll stop it there.
I deeply appreciate that. And it speaks to this idea of how do we move forward when we talk about it, from a government perspective, but really from that community place of reconciliation, of what's needed for us to be in a place of restorative or reparative relationships. Eva, I pass it over to you.
Miigwech, Levinia, that was a really good way, just concise way of putting it. And that you make a last point of saying that are some young people who give us hope, right? And I want to express, I think that our young people are giving us hope actually happens in spite of Canada, not because of it, right? And so the amount of energy that our people have put into attempting to explain, the violence that we experience from Canada for generations is really why we're here. It's not because of Canada's moral clarity or it's because Canada decided that it was, time to reconcile. It was Indigenous people and their hard work forcing Canada to the table. And so that is a barrier to reconciliation, because that's not really sustainable. We are, as Indigenous people, as Indigenous women, required to be so strong, so smart, so powerful, so all these things, so much so that we can do the work of just bringing equity to our peoples and our communities. And that takes a toll on us. It takes a toll on our mental health and our well-being and our communities, because as we know, Indigenous women are very important, central to our communities. That's how it always was. And so we only have the beginnings of equity in this country, maybe say in some places, in some areas like child welfare, and not even including education, because it was the tireless efforts of Indigenous people. And so that willingness to change colonial structures isn't there unless Indigenous people are there, like every day, tirelessly trying to change it. And that's indicative of a system that doesn't want to change. It's a system of white supremacy. It's a system of racism, paternalism, all of those things. And they're very much present in Canada today.
Thank you for naming that, Eva, because I think that is, and I continue to say, we're not going to be in a place to even think about reconciliation unless we're willing to have these really uncomfortable conversations and speak the truth, right? Of that pieces of it. It's such a relational place to be. A very respected Indigenous partner of mine, Stell Raven, uses the expression around of a healing place, that these 3 R's, this resistance and this reclamation of culture and this resiliency, but they came from a trauma place, and being able to lift those up, recognizing these barriers absolutely have existed and continue to exist. So the idea that we're passed into a post-colonial place is not a realistic thing at all within our Indigenous communities. We experience it every day. And I think for me, that leads me into the second question that we'd like to focus on, is thinking of it from this systemic level barrier. So when we look deeply into the government systems, and both of you have this extensive wisdom and knowledge of this, whether it's a legal or justice system or child welfare, health authorities. There's so many places within these colonial structures that that become these barriers. So I'd ask, knowing that this could be very extensive, if you want to even just take one, I think could be really rich, to talk about these, system level barriers and the measures that could come to remove them, or what are some of the mechanisms that you would suggest? Lavinia, I'll ask again that you would start for us, please.
Yes, thank you for that question. Eva, you did really well answering your question. Maybe learning from you. Yes, the subjects that we're into is sometimes it's a strange one, because so much have been taken away from the indigenous people. For the Inuit, I know in schools, when we start schools, a lot of strange things were happening. We couldn't speak our own language, and that was taken away. And a lot of our cultural tradition, drum dancing or throat singing, I never experienced that since I was born, because it was already taken away, and I never knew it was existed. So there were human rights in indigenous people that didn't exist anymore because they were taken away. And it's hurtful to know that, to realize what we lost. We could have lost our language too. A lot of us had lost our language, and the system it was working against the indigenous people. It was not way of our life. And today I have to praise all those children that went to school, that learned how to speak English for the price of losing their own language, and the hurts and what have happened. Our country of Canada have to realize what had been done in the past in order for them to understand why did we have to lose our rights to begin with. We were living rightfully so. I mean, out on the land. Our ancestors were very connected to the land and to the animals, all that seemed to have been disrupted. But things are moving. We're regaining a lot of it, thanks to the young people, thanks to Eva, what you said. The young people are our hope now. Our ancestors have already did their work and brought us to this day. So the young people, the new generation, the younger generation is carrying us. I have to say that because they're doing a lot. And the survivors, I can't never forget what they went through. We support each other. We understand each other. Even if I just meet survivors from other provinces, I just met them. It seems like we've known each other all our lives. That's how connected we are. We stay afloat together, and we really seem to love each other's company.
Nakamik, it makes me think of my own family. My mom is a survivor of residential schools as well, and I see how we both experience systems differently from the trauma that was passed to her, and then the role that I have taken on, and feeling that sense of responsibility to advocate where I can. And so it means that her and I go into a lot of these system processes together. She's someone who struggles with health things now, and so I'm her medical decision maker. Like, these are things that we do together, and I think there's an intergenerational piece to this that I believe you've just highlighted there, Lavinia. That's really important. Eva, would you like to as well speak to what you see as some of those systemic level barriers and then measures to help remove them?
Yeah, so I guess where my mind is at right now is in my own community, in my First Nation. So I grew up in my community, and I attended school on the reserve. And I remember very distinctly not having enough art supplies, you know, and being like, why are all of our art supplies so like, I don't know, they were just really not enough. They would the bare bones paper and this really watery paint. And I really wanted to express myself. You know, my mom's an artist, and so I went to school and I was like, yeah, I want, and during art class, I really wanted to express myself. Um, or wondering why our classrooms are really crowded and small, right? Until we moved to a bigger building, which was had a lot of problem in itself, right? A lot of problems in itself. So when I think about these big systemic level barriers, what it really comes down to is that Canada doesn't believe that our lives are worth funding, right? So Canada has a policy of what we call austerity, which means that they're very strict with their funding. And so when it comes to any aspect of Indigenous life, we know any aspect of First Nations life or Inuit life, that there's just less funding provided, even up in Nunavut. They're giving more money to French language immersion than they are to Inuktitut programs. Like, and how many Inuit are there in, I mean, it's a majority Inuit territory. It's your land, and you know, you've got less funding than a colonial language. In my community, you know, the funding on the reserve, the amount that a child gets is up to 30% less than the child who goes to school off the reserve, just maybe 20 minutes away. And it's precisely because of who we are as Indigenous peoples. They're not going to fund, the Canadian state's not going to fund our well-being. In fact, they benefit from the ongoing erasure of our languages. They don't want people who are connected and learning and knowing our languages and knowing who we are, because then we can populate systems that know our treaty rights, right? They know our connection to our land and continue on those ways of life in future generations. And of course, for First Nations specifically, we have the Indian Act, which is a system of erasure and eradication that takes status away from continuing generations. So, you know, even though my child is Anishinaabe, fully Indigenous, my grandchild might not be, right? Because of Indian Act rules. So this system, when we talk about systems, it can seem really big and scary, but it actually has like everyday implications on the ground for Indigenous people. It's just that Canadians don't experience that, so they don't really know what it means or feels like to be subjected to a system that is designed to erase you.
Absolutely. It makes me think of, and if I could share briefly, of when I think of justice system structures as well are very limiting, whether that's through how things like injunctions and rule of law get used against Indigenous communities and land protectors, and how even though we say like the doctrine of discovery or these ideas of disenfranchisement are like from old and way back when, but when we look at how land gets allocated through a federal government system, it is very similar. If it's not used in the ways they want, then it gets, you know, repossessed in ways that they feel they need. Um, and it also makes me think of our experiences of those who are Indigenous. And then when you add on their intersectionalities, like myself being a two-spirit person, gender diverse, like what my experiences would be like in a justice system if I were to be incarcerated. And we hear so many things and how you know, Indigenous people and gender diverse people, so the queer and two spirits in those systems have no options really, and are just again continue to be victimized in this idea under the guise of rehabilitation. But yet there isn't, and then how that translates back into our communities as we're reclaiming our ceremonies, but then how we include to broaden our concepts, knowing we've gone through a colonized process. So our ceremonies are still in some ways with those touches of colonization of how we open these things up. I think for me, removing those barriers is about that, the opening, the sense of the and the in between, and how we bring our people back in to come into community and into themselves and into these circles to feel safe again. Which leads me into Our next question, and I want to just say we're doing wonderful for time. We will do some Q&A, but certainly feel free to be as expansive in this question as you feel your heart is drawn to do so. And it is, what are the barriers, or what about the barriers on a more interpersonal level? How do these appear, and how can we as individuals address them? And I'll pass it back to you, Levinia, to take us into this journey for this question, please.
Thank you. That's kind of a lot of thinking to do on the personal level. I think I could speak on race to begin with, my own race, because I'm an Inuk person. My mom's side is pure Inuk, no mixed blood whatsoever. My dad's side is from Labrador, and he's got mixed blood there, and he looks white, and he was considered classified as white person by federal government. Remember, federal government ruled everything. Even one agent or one administrator had all the powers and authorities, hurtful ones. As growing up in different places, I was always called Hablunaulak, half-breed. I didn't fight back. I didn't do nothing because my mom and my dad taught me something. They said, we loved each other. That's why we had you. You have to accept yourself for what you are. If they're calling you half-breed, let them. You don't have to be racist. It went on forever, and then I'm called a white person quite often, because sometimes I may not look Inuit to some people, and then so I had to kind of fight back, and I wasn't supposed to, but I had to stand up for myself. My mom always said to me, don't be fighting back, because it's going to come back to you worse than what it began. But I did stand up, and I start standing up for myself. And then when I was called white person, I said, what's wrong with that? Because I was feeling there's really nothing wrong with me. You know, what if I'm white? What if I'm something else? I didn't have a chance to say, I want to be this, I want to be that. I was just born for the way I was, and I accepted myself. Accepting yourself is easier to accept everybody else. Everybody in this world have a right to human right, no matter who it is. All part of the world, all the cultures, we're all the same. We're given breathing space. We have 2 pair of eyes, a heart, kidneys, 2 pair of arms. And then at the end of life, what happens? We all go down. We take nothing with us. So racism have been really hurtful, and it wasn't like that before. I could tell you that when my ancestors were very grateful. There was an exhibition, I think it was called Franklin Exhibition. It's in the books, and I've seen pictures. Everybody should see that and learn from that. There's a ship, big ship, iced in Arctic Ocean, probably around Baffin Island, I'm not sure, but it will tell you where it is. It's iced in its winter time. In the north, it could be -50 below, maybe more. And there's men up there on top of the ship, men. Right beside the ship, what do you see? 6 or 5 igloos, big igloos. Inuit are living there right beside the ship. And I want to teach this to the whole country, to our whole nation and of Canada, because what I saw, I wasn't there, neither of us were there, but the pictures don't lie. The igloos, meaning there's Eskimos, there's Inuit people. Up there, the men are wearing, what are they wearing in the middle of winter time? Not leather boots, not nylon or cotton parka, skin, fur. Inuit people made it, the women sewed for them. So they just wouldn't freeze to death. And they fed them so they don't starve to death. There was a good connection there, good, good building relationship among the two nations, the Inuit and probably Europeans. Not only that, this is a true history I'm talking about, because I didn't see any racist there. It taught me big lessons, never be racist. And not only that, they were building relationship, they needed each other to survive. And this is honest to goodness the truth. They made beautiful babies together. Beautiful. So why is there so much hurt? Why is there so much animosity or whatever's going on when we can love, when we can be kind to each other? They did it. I know a lot of my people might not agree with me, but how else you going to interpret that? The picture is there. The igloos are right beside the ship. I wish everybody in Canada would see that. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Nakamik. I'm going to pass it over to you, Eva. I feel like there's your responses into that, from that interpersonal level. Yeah, being able to know our stories and hold our stories. So I ask you to share.
Yeah, so you bring up a good point there, Levinia, about the Franklin expedition and how for so long they didn't believe Inuit perspectives. They didn't know, they wanted to carry on and continue on researching what happened there without even listening to locals, And I think that there's, just to bring it back to that other question we were talking about too, about the barriers, the system level barriers is paternalism, this idea that you don't require as much as resources as Canadians do, and we determine how much money you get. Well, that systems level comes from somewhere, right? And that comes from an interpersonal understanding or an interpersonal commitment to believing that Europeans are better than Indigenous peoples, when Indigenous peoples know how to live here. This is our land, right? We've developed technologies, worldviews, diplomatic practices, sophisticated governance systems that allowed us to live here and not just survive and eke out a living, but to thrive here. And this isn't widely understood by Canadians, and for the reason that they're not always entirely educated properly about Indigenous peoples. A lot of our current experiences as Indigenous peoples is as a result of colonial violence. The fact that we have lower health outcomes and higher rates of poverty and so on. These statistics, the figures about all the ways that Indigenous peoples lag or fall behind Canadian society, to use that term loosely and sarcastically. They don't tell you anything about who we are as Indigenous peoples. That tells you the outcomes of what happened to us and why it is that we're living, with discriminatory funding or inequities. But who we are, we're very kind. We're very kind people. And we're very friendly, and we're very accommodating and hospitable. And that's who our ancestors are. That's who taught us, right? That's our sensibility for many Indigenous peoples, specifically across this, what's currently known as Canada. And for that reason, when we became in relationship with Europeans, many times we were making treaties or we were making agreements for kin making or adoption. These are all have places in our original governance practices. And those practices get completely co-opted or completely taken advantage of by Europeans because of this sensibility that Europeans are better, this white supremacy, right? And so that is still in micro relationship dynamics, right? So what this ends up looking like is a reluctance to imagine alternatives, right? A reluctance to imagine a world where we follow Indigenous laws. And I don't mean like, you know, because when you think of following the law, you think of being a law-abiding citizen or the police will come and get you. That's a completely Western capitalist way of thinking about it. What does it mean to follow, you know, if I'm in Toronto, what does it mean to follow the law here? It means following Gido Naganina or the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. That means not taking more from the land than you need. That means maybe that, I don't even want to say maybe, that means dismantling capitalism, right? That means even thinking about the behaviors that we perpetuate or, you know, maybe unknowingly or unintentionally that we might reproduce in our families, in our expectations of our children, right? If we encourage these types of behaviors that regenerate capitalist system, like perfect attendance, right? We reward children who get up every day and go to school and sit, you know, from in the classroom from 8 to 2 or 9 to 3 or whatever. We cultivate these practices that help us populate a way of being that's reliant on an economic system that is harming our planet. So it does come down to our everyday kind of actions or behaviors or the way we're thinking, you know, this grind culture or hustle culture, and understanding too that we're within that system, and a lot of times that's how we have to survive. Interpersonally, that looks like, I think, being, you know, more, again, open to imagining otherwise, imagining the alternatives to what can be, exploring what does it look like to be a human being rather than, you know, somebody, a cog in the capitalist system. Language.
So much of what's being shared here really resonates. That idea of a relationship building and what does that truly look like, and how are relationships built that become about this like, because when I think of Indigenous governance ways, I think of working within the circle. And the value of working within the circle, and that everyone brings something that is important, and how we share and move in and out, this fluidity that comes in. I mean, the things we've learned from the natural world, from the elements, this idea that we're in relationship with everything, all, you know, living creatures and the spirit world. It makes me think very much of my elder, Jim Learning. He's passed to the spirit world now, but he had said when we talked about this idea of changing things, and he would say we need people on the front line, we need them behind the scenes, and we need them in the system. And just this approach that can appear so overwhelming, and then we get lost in what can I do as one person, but it's the collective relationship building that all things small and big. I mean, I think of our stories, they're so rich in that it doesn't have to be the, you know, what's viewed as like the most powerful in the community. It's we're always amplified on what we do together. And I think that's what both of your answers are highlighting, along with the realities that within a colonial capitalist system, it's always that we kind of hit up against that barrier of system change is so slow, and we have to go by process, and we, you know, so it's we're trying to convince um the people who benefit from this colonial system that they need to change it. And that can become very hard, even though we know within our Indigenous communities the rich benefits of what happens when we do things back to our natural ways of doing them. I do see that we have a few questions. We have actually lots of questions. I thank Sandra, who's helping me filter through them. The one that really speaks to me that I'd like to bring forward first, that I think could also give this side of the and, like things are yes, very heavy, and we have many issues, and we know the strength that comes with healing. And it's the question is, do you see a place for intergenerational trauma healing in both Indigenous and settler communities as an approach to reconciliation? And Lavinia, I'd like to ask you first your thoughts on that, and then Eva, you can jump in there.
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Eva. Like I said, I'm learning so much from you. We learn from each other, even from children. That's a tough question, but I'm gonna try my best, my very best to answer it, because there are a lot of issues and a lot of hardcore hurts, and a lot of things have happened in the past where there was so much trauma. It became intergenerational trauma and impact and all of those things. But could I ask you to repeat that question, the last bit, please?
Absolutely. I'm just gonna scroll and find it for a moment. There we go, right here. It is, do you see a place for intergenerational trauma healing in both Indigenous and settler communities as an approach to reconciliation?
Mhm. I'll try my very best from my own experience. When back, when I was growing up, it's a very healing exercise, a very loving stuff happened when I was growing up, and we lost all that. Of course, in my time, we never had seen money. Nothing, we didn't deal with money. It was all to do with the exchange of food, maybe, and clothing that the women saw, but they were very good seamstress. And they had to be warm clothing because, like I said, it's very cold where I come from. But sometimes in those days, they might see maybe a man who's poor, was not dressed well. So out of kindness, the elders, the women, would sew for that guy without him knowing, because it takes time to sew, a couple of days or something. So when that outfit was done, presented to him, not in front of a whole group of people, not in a ceremony, no, just to show him love, just to give him something that he needs. And for that gentleman to receive something special like that, that was healing for him. Very thankful. And then other times, if the grandmother or if they like outside their own grandchildren, if they like the little kid, they'll do something for that little kid too, just to have that bonding feeling. So there was all this kind of healing going on. I love and kind of healing for our culture, and it went on. And I know I was given 3 pairs of comics, and they're very fancy comics for me. And I would ask myself, why do I deserve this? And you're not supposed to say no to a gift. I took them and felt guilty. On the other hand, well, they love me enough to make these for me, so I better live better life. I better prove that I'm a good person. It's a person of growth and development that I felt. And today, I'm finding a lot of people are starting to heal from our survivors too. We went through a lot. And we were taught adult stuff. In turn around, they blamed us that we knew too much adult stuff. Why teach us, then blame us? So I have to overcome that guilt. We see stuff that we should never have seen, or stuff that were exposed that we should never have experienced. I talked to a lot of survivors and I heard their testimonies, their stories, and they have a lot of them have similar stories as us that went to residential school, federal day school. It was all there. And how do we overcome that? How did I heal from that? Because when you experience bad things, you don't forget. My mom's word I'll never forget. I don't know why she told me this, but she said, "Panique" means daughter. Panique. What you see and what you hear will always come back to you. Isn't that the truth? All that experience that I had came back so many times. Who did I have to tell? I was so ashamed. And when a little child, when a little person is exposed to those kind of things and abused so badly, how can that little child, how can that little people, how can they learn? But we did. Our ancestors were so strong and they were guided so well by the Creator that we had strength to keep going. We never ever thought of committing suicide. And yet, in our day and age, there's so much. And how did I overcome my fears? And I had a very bad claustrophobic. How did I overcome that? And I wasn't supposed to cry. We were taught crying is just like tap water. You turn it on, you turn it off. So we became like a steel. No feelings, no emotion. Why? It was meant for us to use that emotion. It's in us. That's how we were born. But I was always with the elders. A lot of time on elders. And the elders, they teach you a lot. They even make you feel very comfortable, like you're loved. They'll tell you, come. Mani Xivali, sit here. She's pouring not coffee, but tea. Remember those cups, they're enamel? And they break and they have black because enamel came up. Those kind of cups were very popular. That's all the cups we had. She'd get that cup over there, and she licked it. She licked it, she cleaned it with her tongue like that. Then pour tea for me. Over there, Rich, she got banning. That was so special. Not from my mom, from an elder, from somebody else. So when it came from somebody else, it tastes so good. Your own mother's cooking is the best. So, and I wanted to share that. And today I see that there's a lot of healing going on. Very good, because we have learned strongly to communicate with each other. And I thank every one of those survivors that ever went to school through residential school, federal day school. I thank them. They are survivors. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Levinia, to honor us with that sharing. It speaks to the trauma and to the healing, and that sense of how we learn this together. I know we're soon going to be close to time, but Eva, please, I would love for you to contribute into this discussion as well.
Yeah, I think the intergenerational healing, it has to happen in our communities, right? But what's implied in reconciliation, in a lot of ways that people talk about it, there's a few different ways that it can happen, right? So I really like the way that some scholars like Rachel Flowers or David McDonald or Tracy Lindbergh have talked about reconciliation as having two different distinct paths, right? So for us as Indigenous peoples, our reconciliation is going to look very different. Because if you're asking Indigenous peoples to reconcile with the state of Canada, then that's more violence. That's because Canada is a settler colonial state. It's here on top of our lands, seeks our erasure, all of these types of things. So if you're asking us to reconcile with this Canadian country, that's a form of violence, and that's not reconciliation, right? That's ongoing violence. So that's kind of what we're seeing. That's the reconciliation that's happening now. But what true reconciliation might be is restoring our relationships as Indigenous peoples to who we are. So restoring our relationship to our land, to our languages, in and amongst our communities, with our elders, our babies, and having good relationships in our communities, and healing ourselves, because a lot of those toxic ways of, like what Levinia was saying, are the survivors saw things that they never should have. It just never should have happened. It never should have happened. And we normalize that in our communities and pass that on through the generations, and that's how we get intergenerational trauma. So that's the work we have to do. Now, on the settler side, and I'm going to speak specifically to white Canadian settlers, because there's also different populations in Canada where it's a multicultural country, right? There's a lot of newcomers who are racialized and are coming from other areas of the world that are also impacted by colonialism. Some are refugees when they come here, right? Or they're fleeing conditions in their country that are also caused by the same systems that are harming us. So there's a different kind of pathway there. But what's dominating the conversation a lot of the times, which is indicative of white supremacy, is what do white settler Canadians do, right? And so this question kind of implies that what are white settler Canadians to do? And they do also need to do intergenerational reckoning. Healing, perhaps. It's not my job to say if that needs to be a healing process. I'm not sure. And these are things that I think communities do have when they're talking about critical race theory, or dismantling white supremacy and so on. These are the conversations that are happening, and you can tap into those conversations and think about what it means to unlearn whiteness. And then there's reconciliation amongst newcomers, and that is doing what you can to be in solidarity and in coalition with Indigenous peoples, recognizing that we also do have a lot of trauma as well, and there is a lot of internalized colonized thinking that positions us to think that white supremacy is the measure of well-being as well. So there's a lot going on here. It's a lot to unpack, but it's a great question. It's a very good question. And I think there is a place for intergenerational healing. We talk about the boomer generation being, particularly white Canadian boomer generation, being a huge generation of people that hang on to some beliefs and ideas that are pretty outdated now. Right? Because they benefited from a system that was at its height, at its peak, capitalist system at its peak when they were young. And see, these have to be challenged now, right? These are ideas that have to shift, and reflects the reality that we need to change these outdated ways of thinking.
Nakamik, and I know our time is short. I know there are many, many more questions. I thank you all for them. I have been incredibly humbled and have learned so much being a part of this discussion. Thank you so much, Levinia and Eva, and to NCTR for having and hosting this. I know for myself, reparative work in my life and communities I'm a part of is so critical to me for growing a better environment for the next generations. And I'd like to say for myself, as we create these sacred spaces, that I stay committed to that larger circle of ancestors, the present day beings, and to the next generations, those yet to come. So I encourage everyone in attendance to also consider your role in this journey. And with that, I will pass it back over to Sandra to just say, Nakamik, thank you so much for sharing space today.
Yeah, thank you, Cole, for this excellent moderation. On behalf of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, thank you to all three of you, as well as to our interpreters. Thank you, Levinia. Thank you, Eva. I also needed to acknowledge, and I forgot to say this at the beginning, my apologies. I do need to share that this year's Lunch and Learn program has been supported by Enbridge and the Canadian Public Health Association. And when we're talking about allyship, there are lots of ways that we can show that, and that's one little piece that we've seen. So I've said in the chat and in answer to a few people's questions, you can find these videos from all week long under the NCTR's YouTube channel. I personally find it easiest to find them when you look under the live tab, but it is just called the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. There are so many comments in the Q&A for you, all three of you, giving thanks for the sharing of your lived experience and your wisdom. So thank you so much for helping us all understand a little bit more today of what it means to walk towards reconciliation and in good ways with one another. So with that, thank you. Merci. Hi. Nakaman. Bye, everyone.